unveiling near-death insights, exploring life's mysteries, faith's depth, and science's harmony.
If you were given the option to come back or to stay, would you have stayed? And then she started crying and she's like, yeah, I would have stayed. Even though I love my kids, being in the presence of God was it's just indescribable. And so we see that too when we look, say, like in the New Testament or something like that, how Paul, to die is better, right? To die is gain. And so we can think about those sorts of things. It also kind of gives us that allusion to what the early church, they were said to despise death. And so now that helps free us. And a lot of people who had near-death experiences, they're freed from a fear of death. And that's how a lot of believers should be living, because we have the Lord of life, right? So I think there's a component there. And then there's also an apologetic evangelistic component of how do you explain these things? This is evidence that there's life after death. There seems to be a moral component associated with it. There's a judgment. And so how do we assess those sorts of things? Anyway, I think that's kind of the good overview picture. For me, it's definitely been motivating and encouraging, just hearing those stories.
So would and this is more of a technical question, but I think you're gonna break it into components for us. So as a near-death experience a miracle, by assuming the definition is God's working outside of natural law, although Habermas did, of course, do his jujitsu and say, well, what happens if God starts working inside the natural laws and fulfills a miracle? Or is a near-death experience?
There's not experiments on it too.
Yeah, it could be that too. Or is it God's kind providence? And assuming the difference would be, one is God's working within natural law, one is God's working outside of natural law. But feel free to change that however you'd like to answer the question.
Yeah. This goes back to that point that I made earlier. How do we distinguish between natural and supernatural? I don't quite know how we do that. If we start pressing ourselves, is this world that these people are in, dimension, is that a natural world? Is that a supernatural? I don't know how to define that. I don't think anybody does it when they break it down. This isn't like new to me either. There's a Oxford article. I think that guy's name is Stephen Clark. And he talks about how difficult it is to define this distinction between the supernatural and natural. Because if death has now become this process whereby God's going to, where sin has entered the world and now we have death, then this experience after death is just as natural as the natural world itself. Paul uses the language of seeds decaying and dying to produce a tree. That's pretty natural. So is this just the natural process for us to go through? I don't, you could say yes, but we could also say, yes, the natural world being sustained constantly by God is also a miracle. It's not a direct activity in the sense of like me talking to you or doing like something like an action, but it's God's relation to the world, his sustaining and things like that. There you go. So I don't like those distinctions. And I think when you remove them, you could say, is God acting here? And by acting, we're talking about doing something in the game, so to speak, doing something beyond just like, okay, the environment's there, I'm sustaining it, but I'm interacting. And that's typically what we mean by miracles. That's how they're used too in scripture. They're signs, they're pointers, they're messages about God, or revealing something about him. And so that's why, like, if something just extraordinary happens, but it doesn't communicate something about God, it's just something extraordinary. We don't call it a miracle. So those would be some of my distinctions there. That's actually like the third chapter of my dissertation. I cover that. So if you guys are having trouble falling asleep, or if you want to learn more about that, that's where you go.
So how can God act, or I've heard the term intervene, when we know that he is holding up the entire universe by the power of his word? So in theory, he's perpetually acting, or he's perpetually intervening. So how could there be a distinction or a difference made that he unless I'm misunderstanding that, how could he then, if it's like, well, he's acting here, but he's also acting by holding up gravity, by letting me have air in my lungs. Do we have any concept of that?
Yeah, there's a couple distinctions. One, obviously, the creator is not his creation, right? So they're two distinct things. But then you also have different. There's a nuance between. There's two types of causes. So like, if there was a forest fire, you could say, well, there was a match that, as it was lit, it set this tree on fire, and then that started a chain reaction. That's a legitimate cause to say, like, a match created this fire. But you could also say Steve lit the match because he wanted to see how much of the forest he could burn with one match. And that's also a cause. They're both causes. They're both legitimate causes to say, but we're asking two different questions. And one of those has to deal with agency. And the one with Steve doing it, that has to do with agency. And that's what a lot of history is, right? Science typically wants to know, okay, what is this specific type of cause where, there was a reaction and then match that created heat and so on and so forth. But history is more concerned with, and I think people too, we're typically, unless we're doing science specifically, we want to know like agent activity. And so we're agents, we act all the time. Laconi will use an example of like, I can't bench 315, but if I'm holding the bar and someone comes and gives me a lift or a spot, now I can push up 315, right? That's not a violation of natural law. That's a using of natural law, but you're using other resources to work within natural law. So I think that's why I think when you start getting into natural and supernatural, it gets really confusing, unnecessarily muddled. So you can avoid all that just by saying reality. Just say reality, and now I don't have to worry about all those distinctions.
And I like how you brought up science there as well, because I think one question that many people have is, in 2025, right? Because we can prove, quotes, so much now, and we still can't measure God. We can't put him in a beaker. We can't do some of the traditional scientific tests that we have. So can we really believe that science and Christianity are cohesive together?
Oh man, yes, of course. Oh, it's so good. Stephen Meyer, his first, I think it's 3 chapters in his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. He stresses this over and over again, that the history of modern science is founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and that this is widely acknowledged by historians of science. It is the presuppositions of the Judeo-Christian worldview that lead to doing science.